In 2011, the novel 50 Shades of Grey was published, and over the next 2 years became a bestseller in the erotic thriller genre. Telling the story of nobody cares and it doesn't matter as they not gonna check, the book was successful on an unexpected scale, prompting critical reviews and then an examination of the success itself. 50 Shades of Grey put its author, one E.L. James, into the Forbes list of highest earning authors and resulted in a highly publicized successful movie trilogy. As of date, it's made over $1.5 billion. The examinations of 50 Shades of Grey involved bringing to light its origin as a Twilight alternate universe fanfiction on a fanfiction forum, published weekly from 2009 to 2011. It is one of the most successful examples of a new web creator, where someone made their own transformative fanfiction, it gathered an audience, that audience then were enough to propel the form into the attention of conventional publishing, then that publishing drew in and solidified the existing audience, then used its greater access to propel the work to a higher and higher stage of what we typically call success, because people paid money for it, and money is what we use to fill our souls under capitalism. This success seems completely decoupled from the critical reception, which was, it seems, overwhelmingly negative. I've yet to find someone wholeheartedly speaking well of any of E.L. James' actual work as a writer, now that the fanfiction version has been deleted off the forums it was posted on. The world we live in now is one where it isn't hard at all to find people willing to present a new, interesting examination of 50 Shades of Grey, having read it all, that has to establish that whatever else is going on, the book series is quite bad. Criticizing it, though, automatically brings with it the possibility of being seen as anti-smut, or anti-woman, or anti-Twilight, which is in fact a good thing to be. And there is therefore a typical critical perspective that in order to engage with 50 Shades of Grey, one cannot merely watch a scene and respond to it, or hear the idea and react to that, but instead must completely examine the text, read the books, the notes, and the movies, and then, armed with the references and the citations, explain what they already knew at the start, that this book is as bad as they thought it was, and in fact it was worse. This is a huge task. It's not enough to react sensibly to a thing you know then. The impetus is that you have to understand it deeply and thoroughly. One must eat the whole elephant. This isn't about 50 Shades of Grey. This is about Megatokyo. I want to introduce you to my elephant. Spoiler warning, and content warning, and I guess time warning. I'm going to spoil the entire plot of Megatokyo in this. I'm also going to talk about ideas like racism and misogyny and transmisogyny in a largely PG-rated webcomic. Finally, at the point where I'm writing this paragraph, the script is around 15,000 words. I'm going to do what I can to make it more approachable, but this is not a breezy little video. There'll be annotations and jumping around sections if you want it, but, you know, decide what you're going to do, put this on the second screen. I know how these things go. I'm not going to be putting anything particularly challenging in the visuals to go along with it. But also, while I'm at it, I want to issue a kindness warning. I don't want you to go about showing this to Fred Gallagher, the actual human with actual feelings who may have even harsher opinions on this work than I do. By all means, please share this work with your community and show it to friends who are interested. But if one of those friends is Fred Gallagher, please be thoughtful about whether it would be helpful and kind to do so. Also, all the visuals I'm going to be using here are from Megatokyo. It's all Fred Gallagher's work. So it feels a bit rude to not point out that this work is 20 years old and made for a different version of the internet where GIFs could be very small and it was an acceptable standard of readability. Some things are going to look a bit weird because they're upscaled. Assume that all of the problems you're seeing with the visuals that seem to be janky algorithmic stuff is just a byproduct of compression. I had an obvious problem when I started this project because I simply do not normally engage with the kind of work Megatokyo is. It isn't the same kind of long-form a piece of work as something like a TV series or a long book or even a few movies. Such works, typically speaking, convey their points specifically and with many hands and oversight on the project to make sure it's something that can be reasonably addressed as a chunk at a time. And the result is there's a coherence to it. Even bad TV shows with stories that contradict themselves are made up of episodes that more or less express some consistent ideas. What this article became isn't like that, because the webcomic Megatokyo is an analysis of a large text that is also made up of 1,600 and change individual, distinct, less coherent texts. Further, the form this analysis takes is trying to address a problem of scale. Any analysis of such a long-form text can step on 3 different rakes. It runs the risk of replicating the text in a less interesting way, being just a giant pile of words that is as daunting to read or listen to as the original. It runs the risk of summarizing the text so finely as to disappear important information, and therefore anyone who goes to check will find pieces of the analysis missing and not trust it anymore. And it runs the risk of being exactly the right size and the writer doesn't know it, and therefore instead veers into one or the other. This treatment started in 2023, which is when I first got the idea of re-examining Megatokyo. That was on a tight schedule with no clear idea of what I was doing, and led to me writing a long-form piece that examined only the first year of the comic and considered it in that context. I wanted to think about the work as a 25-year-old webcomic that had been worked on and what that work looked like when the comic was at its most prolific. At the time, I think I came away from the comic with a conciliatory position. I thought about the work as something that clearly overburdened its artist. It chose a schedule early on that at no point did it ever successfully maintain, and then, rather than consider that the schedule needed to change, it instead opted to pad out the space or skip days and apologize for it. This led to it failing to keep up with its schedule, and at the time, I noted about a third of Megatokyo wasn't Megatokyo. Further to that, I reflected on how the current state of Megatokyo as a long-running webcomic with a biannual update schedule that nonetheless had a Patreon of around $1,500 a month as of this writing, and advertised a store and stood under the shadow of a Kickstarter, a story that is still updating the original narrative that was started in 2000 without any kind of plot overhaul or retcon or reflection on its origin, was a special kind of prison that could only impact someone under capitalism. The actual human making the project was someone who very quickly became just successful enough to make something he couldn't ignore as a value generator, but also couldn't sustain, as the demand for art and story was higher than he could deliver. What this original treatment did not do very much of was reflecting on Megatokyo as a text, as a thing that represents what it is, what the story includes, and how it tells that story. At the time, I imagined that it wouldn't be hard to read all of the remaining pages and get to a part 2 of the article, maybe in 1 year. That was 3 years ago. I resolved that it was unwise to try and reconstruct off that article and instead opted for a fresh start with a proper methodological approach, which is a fancy way of saying a plan for how I did this. Now I've done that, and in order to show you how I did this, and in order to demonstrate all the angles of the elephant, let me show you the plan. Part 2. Methodology. I didn't want to consider the many different real-world influences that complicated the situation of Megatokyo's creation. For a start, it's just hard to do. Tracking a real-world calendar of events and the events in the publicly known lives of the people making Megatokyo seems just a huge headache and honestly gets a little stalkery. I know from reading the archives that during the making of Megatokyo, a person involved in the creation had a kid, but I don't want to sit down and chart out, oh, this is when the kid started school, or something just to see if I could map that onto information in the comic. That seems both hard to do and really horrible. Instead, what I chose to focus on was the idea of treating Megatokyo as if Megatokyo was a text. This is tied into what I think of as the fantasy of serialized webcomics, which is presenting a whole narrative, 1 page at a time, and it all should come together and cohere. Part of discussing this is that there's a person involved in all of this who is known as Fred Gallagher. I am not interested at all in examining who he is as a person and his influences, and doing so would be dreadfully unfair and turn him into just an effigy for the problems in the comic that are probably not the result of an individual artist's choices. I have no interest in psychoanalyzing the individual. It would be really easy to sit here making fun of the things in Megatokyo and then saying as a punchline, well, Fred sucks. and if this many words on this many ideas doesn't make it clear, I'm not taking any easy routes here. The aim here is to take a look at Megatokyo with a Bartson approach. You might recognize that name from the phrase, the death of the author, where Roland Barthes established the idea that the author does not possess unique, meaningful control over how the work must be interpreted. Where death of the author is super valuable for finding unintentional or subconscious themes in work, it is also a great framing for this kind of work where the author is literally unavailable to examine it. The author wrote this text 25 years ago and has no trustworthy record of anything it means. That means I'm going to refer to the author in this work, but that refers to a character invented for this analysis and constructed as a person interpreted from the choices made to tell this story as it is. That is, the author is the person to whom the story of Megatokyo makes sense. In order to construct a body of text to read, the corpus, I downloaded a full archive of the webcomic from the Internet Archive. This archive presented all the images as .pings, which they're not. Whoever archived these files renamed them without changing their format, which creates some loading problems, especially where the comics are animated. This archive also ended at comic 1550, which meant that for the last 70 comics or so, I read them on the website. Once I had the archive, I renamed all the files to match their appropriate type and comic number. There's an off by one error in the archive that may create minor problems with some of my links. I passed through the text to look for what I consider filler. That is dead art days where the comic doesn't advance but instead shows something like a pin-up or some cool drawing. Omake stories, which tend to live between chapters of the story. These may reflect information in the greater narrative, but this is already a sizable elephant I am eating, and I shouldn't need omakes to illuminate them. Making of comedy comics, Nazenai Megatokyo, Shirt Guy Dom Days, and Guest Art Days. This did, however, include a number of pages that one could reasonably consider outside the story, with a large pin-up and low-impact four-coma. These pages could be dropped because they don't do anything or show anything that matters later in the story, but at that point I'm making judgment calls about specific in-story comics as to their value. Keeping them in pads the count a very small amount, but being reasonable about it, who cares? It's maybe 5 pages out of 1,000. It's not meaningful. With this rough first pass, I then kept the second directory of non-story pages. Whenever I encountered a page that belonged to the non-story group, I moved it there. This provides a little data for the curious. Of the 1,620 pages, 353 of them are non-story. The first year had 12 non-story pages, but that's an outlier given the comic started in August. The second year was produced with a 3 comics a week schedule, which assumes 156 pages, and featured 54 non-story pages. By comparison, the past 5 years of Megatokyo have featured 3 non-story pages out of 34 total pages. The non-story pages are also concentrated at the start of the comic's life, but that concentration reflects more of the problem with the schedule than anything else. Across 2 days, from the 19th to the 20th of December 2025, I read the entire archive up to that point, numbering 1,236 pages. For comparison, Mouse and V for Vendetta both have a page count of about 296, Watchmen is 416, and The Dark Knight Return compiles to 224 pages. If it was volumes of Full Metal Alchemist, that would be 6 volumes. During this reading experience, I was probably quite insufferable as I pointed things out of context to my friends and family, and to all of them, I wish to apologize. I also set up a spreadsheet of every comic and took notes of things I noticed that were worthy of commentary then went back and back-referenced things that became significant later. This became important over time because otherwise some of the details of the series, especially the timeline and the characters' identities, can be easily missed, because surely it's not that simple. Surely it's not that short. I wrote notes on 409 different comics, and the word count of those notes is over 17,000, which means this data is actually the abridged criticism of Megatokyo. I have processed a lot of the information in a spreadsheet and made some honestly unnecessary tables showing the breakdowns of Megatokyo. Most of it isn't actually that interesting. It took Megatokyo 3 years to reach page 500, and the most recent 3 years have featured 20 pages. That's a novel stat, but all it tells you is Megatokyo isn't being produced very quickly anymore, and that's almost the very example of a well-duh fact. My plan is to discuss Megatokyo in 3 stages. First, I'm going to present the timeline of the actual sequence of events in Megatokyo, constructed through notes, aiming to be as neutral as possible when presenting what's in the text. Then, I'm going to explain things that I think Megatokyo does well that it appears to be trying to do. Third, I intend to discuss Megatokyo in terms of interrogating what choices the author thinks of as important based on their choices in the story. Then finally, I aim to analyze Megatokyo as a whole text, based on this reading experience. Part 3. The text of Megatokyo. A too brief summary. Piro and Largo are 2 guys from America who like video games and are scared of women. They leave America to go to Japan where they meet Nanasawa and Hayasaka, women they white knight and sexually harass respectively. Over the course of 12 days of story, Piro and Largo wind up in relationships with these women, with the remaining story threads being the introduction of a magical girl called Yuki, a robot girl called Ping, Piro's ex-girlfriend Toya, and a collection of kitsune including an unvoiced girl named Ash and a fun punk called Mugi. If you're wondering what happened in that time, then the truest, simplest answer is not much. If you're familiar with Megatokyo and wonder, how did they fill that in? It's actually less interesting than you think. If you dropped out around the time you saw Piro, Largo, Hayasaka, and Nanasawa running around together, then all you really need to know is Piro avoided having sex with teenagers, but not without dating at least one, and then wound up with the first named woman he met in the story. And Largo wound up dating the woman he sexually harassed back in year 1, and these are both treated as very sweet. The full summary. Nonetheless, this is eating the whole elephant, and so in order to account for what I'm doing, and to prove that I've done it, I'm going to give a rundown of the sequence of meaningful events in Megatokyo. When I say meaningful, I mean things that are probably going to be supported later in the story, or express some idea the author seems to want to reiterate. Furthermore, there are things that happen in a comic that I'm skipping because they don't seem to matter. The actual movements of Dom and Ed don't matter because there's no tension to where they are or what they're doing. They're just nebulous villains that appear out of nowhere whenever they want and function without any consequences. Seraphim barely exists to do anything but provide useful information about age of consent laws. The entire story with Asmodeus kidnapping Seraphim and being rescued by Boo is a plot cul-de-sac that doesn't change anything, as is the evil Seraphim idea. Presented then, in as best as I can accord a meaningfully true and largely non-judgmental description of the sequence of events in Megatokyo. Sometimes where story elements have squirmed apart from one another in the continuity, I have tried to pack them together, so a strict point-to-point reading won't look like this. But this is, as best I can give you, the actual story. The prequel and first day. We are introduced to Piro and Largo. They're both young white men from America who are of an age to recently graduate from college, putting them at around 22 years of age. They are both, for lack of a better descriptor, losers who have nothing in their heads beyond video games. They have tastes that diverge slightly in that Piro likes games where women are objects with decision trees, and Largo likes games where women are objects who are old enough to have tits. The comic starts with Largo and Piro going to attend th3, an industry trade show that they can't get into because they're not part of the industry. They lie their way in and attend th3. Largo gets blackout drunk, and while he's compromised and unable to fight back, Piro gets him onto a plane and they go to Japan, which is a thing you could hypothetically joke about doing back before 2001. Without passports, they have to beat a ninja at Mortal Kombat 5 to get into the country, which introduces Junpei. Junpei is, no joking, one of the most important characters in the story. Junpei speaks in broken English, even when he's speaking in Japanese. Piro and Largo arrive in Tokyo, max out their credit cards, and crash with their friend Tsubasa. They attend the Tokyo Gaming Show, where Largo sexually harasses a woman who threatens to break his arm. This is how we're introduced to 2 of the important women of the story, Hayasaka and Nanasawa. Neither of them are given names, and the only thing they do in their introduction is complain about Largo. Hayasaka, the woman who broke Largo's arm, will be dating him after 5 days of character development. Nanasawa is an Anna Miller's waitress that hits Piro in the head with a coffee pot accidentally when they go to Anna Miller's to ogle the hot waitresses, a theme that is going to come up again, both random violence as a punchline and ogling Nanasawa specifically as she does her job. The boys freeload on Tsubasa for 6 weeks, then borrow some money from a friend in the United States, which introduces us to Ed and Dom. They are two of the villains of the story as best I can tell. They lend Largo and Pierrot money, which they immediately waste on not going home and instead spend it on disposable gamer stuff. Pierrot, realizing that this is not in fact a good thing that he just did, and not wanting to refund the material to get the money back, instead goes to a bookstore to read shoujo manga, where he is seen by Yuki. This introduces Yuki, who is a schoolgirl and about 15 years old. This is also when Seraphim, Pierrot's conscience, is introduced and offers him some meaningful plot-relevant information. He should not have sex with that teenager. The story explicitly states that he is not a teenager, that she is a high schooler, and that this age gap is bad. In this meeting, he loses his sketchbook, which Yuki finds and reads and plans on returning to him, including trying to contact him, which his conscience calls a close call. Pierrot, seeing someone modestly distressed about not having a rail card, hands them his rail card and walks home instead. Someone in question is Nanasawa. Neither recognize each other, which stands to reason, because Pierrot is not memorable or noteworthy as a blonde American in Tokyo that she hit in the face while she was at work. Following this, Seraphim does not introduce any meaningful information to the story and is otherwise a rhetorical device for interrogating Pierrot's inner life with two unreliable narrators. Pierrot accidentally gets a job at a fan merchandise store by doing literally nothing. Largo accidentally starts a zombie apocalypse with the aid of his new conscience, the hamster Boo from Baldur's Gate 2. We were also introduced to Toya, a young woman that scares Largo. We don't get her name for over a year. Tsubasa visits the game store where Pierrot works and introduces Ping, a dead-eyed robot peripheral meant to plug into a PS2 and take on personalities from visual novel characters. At the end of this day, Largo and Pierrot return to Tsubasa's apartment only to find it completely empty, with Ping left on the floor. Tsubasa has left the country to pursue his dream of a girl from Oklahoma or something, inspired by Pierrot's example, which is horrifying. They get evicted! This ends the prequel, with the status quo of the comic almost completely established. Pierrot and Largo are homeless with their PS2 peripheral high school girl Ping. Pierrot has a job at a gamer store without ever trying for it, alongside Hayasaka, who got him the job. Hayasaka and Nanasawa are roommates, and Nanasawa is working at Anna Miller's while looking for voice acting work. Yuki has Pierrot's sketchbook and wants to return it. Day 1. Things should speed up now that all the pieces are in place. Pierrot goes to work where Hayasaka bullies the boss into giving him an apartment upstairs. Largo stalks Toya to school and in the process is mistaken for, then becomes a school teacher at a Japanese high school. Largo does not speak Japanese. Yuki comes to Pierrot at his job and returns his book bag. Pierrot finds that Yuki has taken notes on his artwork, pointing out that bras look uncomfortable or his hair design is bad. Ping befriends Toya at school, and then Toya fights with Largo at an arcade. Pierrot, passing by, meets Toya. No information is exchanged. Pierrot is confused. Nanasawa goes to work where she's sexually harassed and responds by pouring coffee in the harasser's laps. Then, reflecting on her roommate's co-worker, Pierrot, she gets spaghetti at work to take to him with intention of sharing it with him. When she gets there, she finds him with Ping, the high schooler robot, in his apartment and leaps to the conclusion that she should not intrude and definitely not ask, and gives them the spaghetti before leaving. We see Dom and Ed, gun-toting villains, on a boat to Japan. Day 2. Yuki is upset about not having done more when she returned the sketchbook to Pierrot. This continues throughout the day, with her thoughts only being occupied with the American artist. At Pierrot and Largo's place, Toya shows up and takes Ping to school. Largo meets Erica at Pierrot's work for a second time and immediately sexually harasses her. Pierrot sends him out to go make fake robots out of trash. Largo left a note for Junpei, who shows up to help. Ed and Dom show up in Japan now, looking for Largo. Largo meets Toya and threatens her. She doesn't want to fight him and sends him to his job at the school she attends. Nanasawa has a voice acting audition. She doesn't nail the actual audition, but she does impress the director, who decides they may be able to overhaul the game's plot if they have a voice performer like that to build around. At school, Yuki has more feelings about not having done more with the book bag exchange. Toya goes to class with Ping and faints. Ping panics and tries to help her friend. Largo considers trying to kill her. Junpei and Ping take her to the nurse's office. Ping stays there, protecting Toya, and beats up Ed when he tries to kill Toya. Toya takes Ping home that night, and Ping phones Pierrot to criticize him for not being more aware of what she's doing. Seraphim gives Pierrot a little speech about how people will usually assume the worst of him for his incredibly socially normal interest of anime in Japan. Pierrot bemoans that he didn't do anything wrong. He spends the rest of his workday having a little spiral about it. Yuki approaches him and asks for drawing lessons, and after some dissent, he agrees. We also see Largo show proof that not only does he actually work having a teaching position, but he's being paid for it after one day. Hayasaka takes Piro, Largo, and Nanasawa out for dinner at a beer garden, where Piro and Nanasawa learn that Piro is the one who gave her the rail card. Also in this day, an evil conscience named Asmodeus is introduced, and I am dropping him from this summary because he does not matter and you should not care. Day 3. We start with Piro at work. Yuki reminds Piro of the class that night. Ping and Toya head to high school together. Largo continues paranoidly constructing robots out of extremely valuable trash which is freely available. Dom and Ed meet Junpei, threaten him, and lose their guns. Largo teaches his class by taking them to a Japanese arcade. Toya and Largo once again have a battle at the arcade, playing a video game. Piro goes to talk to Nanasawa, and they learn she is the one who hit him with the coffee pot. Also, she learns that Piro likes the character she's going to voice, and he gives her some fan art of her, getting to be Nanasawa's first fan. There's a thread through here discussing Piro and why he always draws sad girls. Don't worry, he reassures. It's not because he's sad. Finally, Piro forgets the class with Yuki and goes to read a bunch of free shoujo manga at the bookstore. Meanwhile, Largo gets arrested and sees a rampaging kaiju. To fight it, he manipulates Ping into attacking him, then fools her into attacking the kaiju. Then, he gets arrested again. Then, he returns to the story with a new special contact operative qualification with the Japanese police, which is also an unlimited credit card. Day 4. We start the day in Piro and Largo's place. Largo has built a big computer network because he has unlimited money now. It is cooled with beer and insulated with breakfast cereal. Ping needs a bath, so Toya takes her to a public bath. Yuki is depressed because Piro forgot her drawing lesson. We learn that Hayasaka used to be someone very famous, and now isn't. Toya meets with Largo and Piro, and there's something of an explanation as to who she is and what this means. This explanation is very confused and does not clearly convey meaningful information, but it also doesn't matter, so you don't have to worry about it. Ping and Hayasaka meet. Hayasaka immediately sides with Ping. There's a thread in this day of Nanasawa, the voice actor for a visual novel, seemingly criticizing visual novels as a media form for being too easy. Hayasaka is stalked by her fans, and Largo repels them. Oh, and finally, Piro forgets the drawing lesson again. Day 5. Hayasaka's identity is leaked and the store is mobbed. Piro and Largo save her from this. We learn that Yuki is the daughter of the cop that arrested Largo. Largo plays video games against Hayasaka and continually sexually harasses her. I'm not kidding. This is everything meaningful that happens in this stretch of 107 pages. Day 6. Hayasaka has settled immediately into a routine of meeting with her fans, but only one at a time. She wants a computer, so she gets Largo's help building it. Ping brings an invite to a nightclub to Piro from Toya. Nanasawa continues to do voice acting work. Hayasaka goes to buy a computer and gets sexually harassed by strangers, and there, we know it's bad. Ping deliberately blocks a phone call from Nanasawa to Piro. Nanasawa was calling to psych herself up for an interview on the radio, and in the process says something she thinks goes badly. She stands up for fanboys, mocking the woman mocking men, and then taking the Chad co-host down a few pegs too. This goes super well, and the host want her back, but she doesn't stop to ask them that, and just assumes everything fails and sucks. Ping blackmails Piro into 2 dates. Piro takes Ping to the nightclub to meet with Toya. Toya sexually harasses Largo, which is framed as horrifying. Piro rescues a very drunk Largo and takes him home, and a magical girl, who is revealed to be Yuki's mother, fights Junpei. Yuki discovers that Nanasawa is a voice actress, and her brother is a big fan of hers. Day 7. Nanasawa gets positive feedback on her radio appearance. Largo sees a high school student doing compensated dating and ignores it because his feelings are hurt by Hayasaka, and that student then challenges him to a video game because she's sad that great teacher Largo has given up. She speaks fluent English to do this because Largo doesn't speak Japanese. Yuki finally gets her art class with Piro. Piro claims that he doesn't draw sad people because he's sad, they're not his feelings, again. This class is interrupted by Toya feigning distress and upsetting Ping at Piro. Dom threatens to kill people at random, with a gun. Fanboys overwhelm the store following Hayasaka, and Largo rescues her from her fanboys. Ping rescues Toya from the ensuing mess, but drops her and Yuki gets hurt. Yuki's dad, the cop, is there and he notices and comments. We learn that Hayasaka is friends with Yuki's parents, but was for some reason told to keep her distance from them because they didn't want her around Yuki. This is, it turns out, a lie. Ping gets distressed about being a bad character. Piro reassures her by doing nothing. Yuki steals Piro's book bag. Again. Largo explains his distrust of leeches to Hayasaka and relates a story about Piro and his shared history with Toya, but it's told vaguely, so we'll cover what actually happened later when a clearer version of the story is presented. For now, know that it Dominics the Deegan. Nanasawa continues doing her voice acting work but has problems with singing. She then goes to her Anna Miller's job where she is mobbed by fanboys. Pierrot shows up to help protect her. She's upset by their behavior, thanks to their interaction with Pierrot highlighting what's happening, enough to threaten to flash the room her panties, only to see everyone pull out their cameras, then storms off in disgust. Pierrot asserts himself over the other fanboys and breaks someone's camera for trying to take inappropriate pictures of Nanasawa. Nanasawa is not shown seeing this. Nanasawa is upset at Pierrot for what he did, mad that he tried to save her, and as she gets onto the train to storm off, she simply says, "You probably even thought it'd help you get laid tonight." Pierrot responds with, "I didn't deserve that," as the doors of the train close, and Nanasawa has a little breakdown for realizing what a terrible thing she had just done to poor Pierrot. Day 8. Ping wakes up with boobs. Toya shows up to pick up Ping for school, but then offers to have breakfast with Pierrot and Largo. Hayasaka builds the computer Largo designed for her and gets naked to do it because she believes Largo's belief that nudity is necessary for computers. Largo rebuilds Pierrot's workplace to be a cardboard labyrinth of traps. Nanasawa tries to quit the voice acting job 2 days in. Hayasaka asks for Pierrot's help with making her computer and also wants him to get nude. Largo starts his English class on making computers and then demands his room full of children strip naked to do it. Toya negotiates him down into merely putting everyone in their sports uniforms. Ping is bullied at school for having interesting hair and huge tits. Yuki protects her. Toya protects Yuki. Toya tells Yuki that Yuki is a magical girl. Yuki doesn't believe her. They abandon Ping in the middle of an emotional crisis. Yuki falls off the power lines where she was talking to Toya without realizing onto a boy she likes. Nanasawa brings Ping to Pierrot at his workplace. They talk, they hug. Largo goes to hang out with Hayasaka. Pierrot and Nanasawa fall asleep together watching TV. Largo and Hayasaka start to make out, but Largo runs, because he's awkward. Day 9. Largo, Pierrot, and Nanasawa and Hayasaka all chat with their respective same-gender friend about their interaction with their opposite-gender friend. Nobody communicates well. Toya rescues Nanasawa from Dom, who shows up to threaten a woman with proof that he's surveillancing her. We get our first hint that Toya isn't a normal person when she teleports her and Nanasawa away from Dom while he draws his gun. We also learn that Toya is Pierrot's ex and their relationship was a remote one, and that she is in fact old enough that this isn't super weird, but also she's still going to high school in a school uniform for some unexplained reason. Dom tries to claim Nanasawa as an idol for his parent company. Nanasawa decides to not quit the voice acting job. Hayasaka makes a date to have dinner with her old friends and Largo. Yuki pursues Pierrot as he goes to confront Nanasawa's stalkers that met with him on the internet. Yuki dresses as a maid in a maid cafe. There they learn that the company Nanasawa is trying to quit is about to fold. Nanasawa resolves to attend the public meet and greet for the game she quit, made by the company that won't last the day, at a mall. The zombie apocalypse Largo unleashed 8 days ago finally comes to a head in the mall as a crush of people that Largo has to fight his way through to try and get Pierrot there in an action sequence that takes over 100 pages. Pierrot decides not to go all the way and instead waits outside because this moment isn't about him. Then Nanasawa's stalkers get him to Nanasawa anyway because they love him because they think he represents the ideal protagonist of the game she's going to voice in. Pierrot boldly decries them because he is not the protagonist. She is. Toya clears up the zombies thanks to a friend or because their permit ran out. Largo gets fired from his special combat position and arrested, but he evades it thanks to Hayasaka. We see Dom, who invests in the company Nanasawa quit and unquit. Then Ed shoots Toya with many, many mega lasers, implying she's dead. A week break. For, quote, something like a week, nothing happens. In this time, Pierrot gets his glasses replaced after Largo broke them 2 days ago that I didn't mention because it doesn't change anything. Day 10. Ping's boobs are gone. Largo is dating Hayasaka, Pierrot is dating Nanasawa, Largo still is doing his job at the school, and Largo is using a terrible translation device to get by rather than learning Japanese. Nanasawa suggests Pierrot submit his art to the company making their game, since he already loves the character. Ping is bullied at school for having great hair and no tits. The story names Junko, the student who is doing compensated dating that Largo ignored. She has a bad relationship with her dad. He and she will not matter in 2 days' time. Junko then finds out that Ping and Yuki are special and her world is now full of weird, powerful people. We finally learn the backstory proper of Pierrot and Toya. They were friends on an MMORPG. Their relationship extended beyond the game to phone calls and photo exchanges. This game was capable of sustained worlds with ongoing simulation and character options such that it's possible for characters to have sex, and those characters that have sex can get pregnant. We find this out because Pierrot played a woman and had sex with at least Toya's character, who was a man. Pierrot's character got pregnant, which distressed Pierrot. In the ensuing fighting over this, Toya claimed to be a man in real life, mocked Pierrot, and Pierrot was upset by believing he'd been lied to, leading to him quitting the game. While this is explained, Ping and Yuki try to look for Toya, who is, as far as they know, missing after we, the audience, saw her being shot with big super cannons that implied she's dead. This information is in part revealed because Yuki steals Pierrot's laptop, on which he has the logs of all this information. Yuki goes out to a nightclub looking for Toya. Largo and Hayasaka go there too to help her out, which degenerates into attacking people at the club who may or may not be zombies of some variety. Yuki learns about Toya, that she is a story people play. Yuki follows this thread and finds Toya alive in what looks like a hospital bed. The pair escape out the window but wind up back at the nightclub, where they meet up with Hayasaka and Largo, where he defeats the Horde with a single clever move, and then they head home on the train. Pierrot arrives at the hospital, only to find the window broken open and the bed empty. Day 11. Pierrot wakes up in his jail cell after having beaten up Pedo Bear. Yeah, that Pedo Bear. He insists he has no idea what is going on and bails on about $70. When he gets home, he finds Toya asleep in his bed. She explains across multiple locations that she is an undead story about a girl who died, and there's a horde chasing her when they can follow her story. Yuki is upset about hurting the boy she has a crush on. We are introduced to Mugi, a kitsune who is a friend of Toya's. An enormous explosion follows as the Horde, which is just kind of an abstraction in explosions, attempts to consume Toya. Yuki impersonates Toya and flees, leading the Horde after her. Pierrot punches Largo in the face, hospitalizing him. Toya holes up at Pierrot's place, where she argues with Nanasawa, who punches her in the chest, hospitalizing her. Day 12. At the hospital, the Horde comes for Toya again, but Nanasawa impersonates her and fakes dying with Pierrot's help. Junpei takes Toya back to his place to hide, and Pierrot sneaks Nanasawa away so the Horde doesn't see that she hasn't died. Ping has different hair and belly fat now. At this point, the story takes a sharp turn and spends time introducing lore for the Kitsune characters. They take up a lot of space at this point and are central to the last 200 pages of the comic, but their story also largely doesn't go anywhere because there's nowhere for it to go. There are Kitsune in this Tokyo, and they are an interesting family of overly visually similar characters with specific quirks. We get some slice of life with them. Ping tries compensated dating, but don't worry, it's her dad. That's a glib summary, but it's also not wrong. Pierrot and Nanasawa wind up at a love hotel, and they fuck. Day 13. This is only a partial day, largely focused on expanding the Kitsune story and cementing how good Largo and Pierrot are with their respective partners, who they have known for something like 20 days. That's it. That's the plot of Megatokyo across all its chapters and days. Part 4. Praising the Good. It's relatively easy when talking about any work, especially a troubled work like Megatokyo for the 1000th time, and more so after spending so much time as I have reading and rereading the text, to reduce it to a sort of silhouette of its worst elements. And make no mistake, I'm going to talk extensively about Megatokyo's weaknesses. Nevertheless, it is a work of some impressive qualities, and I wish to construct a more whole, more real image of what it is, so that when I cut into it, it bleeds. Let us then speak about things about Megatokyo that I think merit unvarnished praise. Megatokyo's visual presentation is, for the standard of webcomics in 2000, a cut above. It was by no means the prettiest 2000 webcomic. Shutterbug Follies is a full comic-ass comic, beautiful and well composed within its genre, and Sinfest, no, I'm not linking that, for all that its relentless downward spiral of an authorial narrative, and one day we will speak on that one, did come to the internet in 2000, and it looked incredible from day one. Probably due to the 6 previous years of newspaper publication. These two striking outlier examples aside, Megatokyo is one of the best looking webcomics of the time, and notably one of the few that's trying for the visual aesthetics that people knew existed, but had not seen actually implemented anywhere. It's a style now that we sometimes attach to the idea of Amera manga, where an artist who has been informed by watching exported anime and manga of the 90s aggregates visuals from all of that space. Megatokyo, the art style, while it has its weaknesses, is still distinctive. This art style is distinctive enough that it's hard to find artists who can properly replicate it. This was stated as one of the challenges in making the Megatokyo visual novel. The art style combines a particular kind of expressive, wide-faced head with a long body that can include detailed clothes, varied heights, and a range of detailed eye-based expressions. It does this in part by sacrificing the detail of facial features like noses and mouths, and mostly limits head shapes to a small number of familiar blobs. Another impressive part of the style is that the artist understands architecture and framing in a way that webcomics of the time often didn't. Cityscapes are rendered in detail, buildings are varied rather than big white boxes, and rooms have things like support beams or features that speak to an understanding not just of how shots are composed, but also how the buildings that make up those shots matter. While we're on the visuals of the comic, the visual language for representing comedy and timing are quite good. There are points in the storytelling where the comic presents an action, then a wide shot showing the first, then second beat of a reaction, for example. There's a bit of the classic Takahashi-style comedy, only showing the aftermath of a reaction, where Takahashi's Ranma 1/2, for example, uses this to represent super fast actions. Megatokyo uses it to present a character entering a scene after an action, usually Pierrot discovering the aftermath of one of Largo's silly ideas. Another thing the art does a truly incredible job of representing is about being swarmed and overwhelmed by hordes. This plays into one of the themes that I think Megatokyo does a good job expressing. See, running through most arcs as a background element that seems to show up almost as if it's a natural conversation topic is an ongoing anxiety about consumption. The story seems afraid of being reduced to being a thing for consumption and disposal. And when the story bends around these ideas, it's really good at representing it. Pierrot's inability to control his own spending, Largo's alcoholism, these are smaller metaphors for them as consumers, while Nanasawa and Hayasaka view the world as a thing that wants to consume them, and they need to be prepared for it. Toya's whole story is about being turned into a thing for a relentless audience to feast on, no matter what she wants for herself, to the point where they want her to die while she wants to live. Numerous scenes show thoughtless hordes of consumers pressing against our focal characters, and it's a claustrophobia the story invokes and the art expresses well. I also think that in the Nanasawa-Pierrot relationship, there's a point where Pierrot describes being Nanasawa's first fan, which presents a very pure, very sweet idea of loving something, but also loving the people who make it for who they are and what they are doing. I think in this one scene, there's a really sweet way to read that, in defiance of the way Megatokyo normally presents fandom, which could be used to inform a greater reading of the whole. While we're talking about the way the story is structured, common interpretive lens that I think holds the ideas together well is that the story treats the characters of Pierrot, Largo, and Toya as characters from types of video games, with different genres that inform the stories they're part of. Largo's narrative is somewhere between Unreal Tournament, Gears of War, and Dead Rising. In his narrative then, this informs the way he sees the world as a series of vending machines he can interact with that give him stuff. The default position of the world is dangerous, he can recover very quickly from any harm without any explanation, he can drink bottomless quantities of alcohol, and weapons and ammunition are both easy to obtain and convenient to use. Pierrot, on the other hand, is more like the protagonist of the category of what we now call cozy games, with a bias towards dating sims. We see him playing a farming game at one point, at least as he says. This is why his experience is largely dialogue-driven exchanges with women where the narrative carries him along from point to point, rather than require him to do things that require skill or focus. The most common thing Pierrot has to do is manage a schedule, and his failings are usually doing something wrong in a dialogue choice. Toya is also, it seems, part of a visual novel of the same genre as Pierrot's tastes, and it is expressed in how she can move around the world and how she treats all interactions in terms of playing. This isn't as well explored or as explained as the other two perspectives, but that may be because while Pierrot and Largo represent types of player characters, agents, Toya's form is that of a subject, upon whom agents act. Also, as much as it may feel like faint praise in the context of the greater scope of these things, you don't get thousands of words of notes and writing on a comic that has nothing going on. I'm not about to unpack Checkerboard Nightmare and find this much to say, even if it comes from the same mind as Candle Cove. Nor is Sluggy Freelance the kind of work that presents a singular coherent story that's meant to play out across its whole reading length. Megatokyo wants to tell an intimate story of fragile hearts. It wants to show high-impact panoramic action, and it wants to express a love it has for what it imagines all of its cultural interests, from a headwater of remembering a time when those interests had to be gathered in rare, tiny pockets, when they were precious things and not the dominant, hegemonic, global cultural framework. Where Megatokyo affects me, I find it very charming, which makes my frustrations with its failings much worse. I do not think the worst of its evils are because of an intention to promote bad ideas, and I don't think it's the work of someone hateful or foolish. It is part of the great tragedy of Megatokyo. It is a work with potential, elevated to intense scrutiny and then never given the support it needs to be better, which includes meaningful, thorough critical engagement that regards the text as a work of intention and effort. Rather, it is a work that has been nitpicked and hated, and I understand, I really do. In this moment, I hate Megatokyo. But I think I hate it better than anyone else. Part 5. Interrogating the author. Michel Foucault, Jump Scare, describes that the idea of the author is a title and a role that isn't connected to the task of writing, but rather that the role of an author is created by an audience seeking someone to whom they can attribute praise or punishment for writing they've read. This is a simplification of the author function, but consider this. Are you an author if you write a bunch of words in a book and then nobody ever sees it? Is making a book nobody sees authorship, or is authorship a role we attribute to a person that distinguishes them from just someone who has done the action of writing? The philosophy I approach Megatokyo with as a text is to consider it as a whole text made by an author that presents the story they want to tell and chooses to tell it in this way. I know this isn't true. There are real material factors that impacted the lives of Rodney Carsten and Fred Gallagher and all the other people who contributed to Megatokyo. The timeline of non-canon pages and also just the story takes 25 years to play out suggests that it's impossible for this actual author to be actually unaffected by the flow of time. For this treatment, I am going to describe a character called the author. The author is the person who is responsible for Megatokyo, and Megatokyo is, in its current state, the story the author wants to tell. This does create some strangeness, but because we have this composite character, we don't have to try and reason out whether or not what the author is choosing to do is a good or smart thing, because the important thing is just that it is what the author wants the story to include. The author is assumed to be executing on their wants. This doesn't imply the author is competent at their story, or that they're immune to making mistakes. We assume in this context that the author is a person, and this person has human experiences and wants, which includes things like their norms. Here's an example. The author communicates fluently in English. This is an easy idea extrapolated from the fact that Megatokyo is written in English, and when it represents non-English languages, it tends to represent them in English. This means that if there's something Megatokyo seems to value, it's probably because it's something that the author wants to talk about or value. Now, with this character device, we approach a new problem. The author is a big dipshit. What does this author care about? The tagline of Megatokyo on its own website and merchandise is a reassurance and an inclusion. Relax, we understand you. It's constructed in elite speak, an internet dialect of the time, and it's meant to include a sense of inclusion. Who then is the you this webcomic seeks to include? What does its vision of you encompass, and who does it exclude? Well, the you of Megatokyo, based on my reading, has definitely an interest in games and anime fandom of the time as a sort of fanboy. They also seem to be overwhelmed or scared of women, interested in Japan, and they are likely sympathetic with the author of Megatokyo's anxieties about how hard it is to be an author. From this, we can interrogate Megatokyo in terms of the author's relationship to games, their relationship to misogyny, their relationship to emulated oppression, their relationship to racism, and their relationship to the challenges of being an author. The author and games. Let us start with the shortest and simplest, he lies. Megatokyo discusses the idea of play only as it pertains to video games, with a minimal interest in or engagement with the idea of play in most of its forms. Play is represented through commercial purchase of items, and the actual play of games is largely represented off-screen. There are a few scenes of gameplay, but they are themselves things that can be represented by avatars of the players, Piroko and Largo, and in that case, they typically resemble a vaguely explained MMORPG that resembles Monster Hunter to me, and a PvP arena shooter inspired by Quake 3 Arena or Unreal Tournament. I think of play as an incredibly expansive idea in media. Play is a useful descriptor for any situation in which agents are able to engage with ideas and spaces in a way that is understood to follow rules and express a fiction that people can accept and share without ever committing to the needs of those rules or fiction to be enforced. Play in Megatokyo is mentioned in surface and slightly confused way, without a coherent model of what it means to play and what counts as playful behavior. Something I think of as important to demonstrating an awareness of play as a topic that the speaker can provide meaningful insight on is whether or not they can understand the scope of the idea. Basically, if someone wants to talk to me about what games do or how games work, and their example or description immediately runs into a counterexample from material physical games or social games or deduction games, or indeed even also in video games, then it's not that they're wrong per se, but it suggests that whatever idea they have is simpler than they necessarily think it is. Play can be constrained tightly by rules, or it can be very free of them, and instead of more about the fiction of it, something Roger Caillois describes in Man, Play, and Games as being about the play of an actor or the play of a gear. There's no discussion of sports, of tabletop games, of board games, not even the fandom-related types of play like cosplay. In Megatokyo, there's even a character who cosplays regularly, but she does it entirely for work. She does not make her outfits. She does not care much for her outfits. The outfit changes are used by the story to explain Piero's reaction to schoolgirl uniforms, but not anything about what she's choosing to express or finds interesting. There is a thread throughout the story about making a game. Nanasawa is working on a game after all, contributing to the voice acting of a visual novel. This is used as a platform to talk about making characters for games and how those characters need something imbued into them to make them real. Given the shallow reference pool and the lack of engagement with this idea of how and why people play with one another, and how this idea intersects with the idea of a fear of being consumed, it seems to me that games are less about any awareness of what goes into a game, or how a game works, or why people play it, than about the existence of games as a consumable object. From this, I make the case that the author does not understand or care about video games, but is using them as a metaphor for being an author creating an ongoing webcomic. The author and misogyny. We must now move on to this one because it builds on Megatokyo's most obvious failing. Megatokyo is a misogynist story. It's a story where women are objects and men act on those objects. Rather than just take this as granted, I thought I'd make a short list of normal events that happen in the story as part of other events that help indicate the way that this narrative regards women. The first woman in the comic is an off-screen appearance of a Lara Croft cosplayer. In Comic 102, the comic shows its first instance of a woman talking or thinking about something that isn't Piero or Largo. In Comic 113, the comic almost passes the Bechdel-Wallace test here with two women talking about a dropped object, but at this point, Toya doesn't have a name. In Comic 125, we do pass the Bechdel-Wallace test, with Hayasaka and Eric talking about work. However, showing that the Bechdel-Wallace test is not a uniform sign of representation, while it's happening, Hayasaka is being sexually assaulted by a stranger grabbing her ass. One of the main characters is a girl robot that one of the other characters owns, and they routinely assert that she isn't a real person. She is discarded like a possession. Her seeking her own agency and identity is treated as a confusing ethical question. Her vagina is mentioned twice. This is despite it also being stated that Ping is not meant to be enabled for such functionality. Ping also attends a high school. When Boo returns to the Conscience organization, he's presented as getting whatever he wants because women consciences are overwhelmed by how cute he is. The men consciences react to this with, well, of course, that's what they're all like. Voice actresses are described as messed up in the head or airheads, but it's by a woman, so it's okay. Idols and magical girls are resources that companies fight over and are referred to as being used up. Specifically, an idol is described as not a person, but a commodity. It's by a villain? I hope? Seraphim talks about women in thoroughly demeaning ways, including invoking their sexual agency to exploit Piero over Piero's ability to choose not to have sex with them. Seraphim also flashes another conscience to defeat him. Seraphim specifically is a misogynist. While on the topic of teenagers and sex, the story touches on compensated dating briefly, and it describes it as a teenager taking advantage of an older man. This is even presented as a memory of a robot with no specific reason to lie. I could go on. So I will. Here are some incidents I can find where a woman is sexually harassed. Page 21, a character threatens a woman in a video game so badly she shoots him. Page 23, a character sexually harasses a booth babe dressed as Kasumi from Dead or Alive and gets attacked for it, breaking his arm. Page 99, a character calls women evil. He knows nothing about her, like literally, he's never seen her before. Page 135, a character gropes a high schooler. Page 211, a character meets a woman and before asking her name, asks if her breasts are real. Page 296, a character breaks from a conversation to point out that a character has large boobs and then suggests that they have sex. Page 415, a character expresses disgust at the bodies of women, be they robots or not. Page 544, a character randomly grabs a woman by her breast and gets distracted by it. Page 623, a character finds a woman who wants some privacy after experiencing harassment and ignores her, telling him to leave her alone. He wants to play video games. Page 626, while playing a video game with a woman, a character comments on her breasts repeatedly. This woman has been being harassed all day. Page 653, a character tells a woman to strip naked to use her computer because he incorrectly believes it prevents static buildup. Page 761, a character watches a child he's responsible for doing compensated dating and ignores it. We subsequently see this child's underwear because she's playing a fighting game with him on page 771. When the child thinks she's being sexually harassed and reacts badly to it, this character criticizes her for defending her boundaries. He then claims, quote, all women feel threatened when you try and help them, end quote. Page 880. Ping wakes up with breasts. A character immediately leers at them. Page 918. A character tells a room full of children to strip naked to use their computers better. Page 1363. A character immediately sexually harasses one of the foxes in her first appearance. Then he gropes her in front of a group of teenagers. This is noteworthy because this page is from 2013. What a long and needless list of random incidents of sexual harassment, right? Well, here's the thing. This isn't just a list of time characters sexually harassed someone in the whole comic. This is just stuff Largo did. Remember, Largo is meant to be one of the heroes of the story. Furthermore, there is a point where Largo gets sexually harassed by Toya, groping him, which the story frames as deeply horrifying and bad, despite him having done it to at least 5 people at that point, which makes it very clear that the story recognizes that actually violating people's boundaries is bad. I'm not done though, because Largo's story and his immense constant misogyny gets to be part of the background material for one of Megatokyo's worst and most vile sins. If you've been listening along so far, you know Largo gets a girlfriend. Did you track that she's the booth babe who he sexually harassed back on page 21 and who broke his arm? And the woman he sexually harassed regularly up to page 626 when they became a couple? Her name is Erika Hayasaka, and she is one of the most interesting characters in the story. Erika is a former voice actor and idol who at the start of the story is doing a variety of work that seems to focus on her being involved in fanboy franchise material, cosplaying and promoting the goods while keeping her identity as a former idol secret. Hayasaka is presented as someone who I think is broken by the abuse and expectations of the world around her. She's the woman groped by a stranger on the train while she explains that in order to succeed in voice acting, sometimes you just have to accept the roles you're given, after suggesting that Nanasawa should fuck her producer. Hayasaka is shown as being superpoweredly strong, physically capable, and having her life together. Her story arc is about that threat of being consumed with an audience that only wants her for what they imagine her to be, an object for consumption. She retreats to the back room of the store where Largo goes, ignores her asking for privacy. He drinks beer and plays video games against her and immediately starts talking about boobs. This is treated as the transition point for their relationship. Largo has not changed and has not stopped insulting, degrading, and abusing women and his friends, and has definitely not stopped relentlessly sexually harassing her specifically. After this, they start dating. The author has put this theme through the whole breadth of the comic at every level, incidental or focal, which means there's no indication or point in which the story actually gets better about this kind of treatment of women. Even recently, like the past few years. Women are objects to be won, they are things to be consumed and claimed, and while there is a right way to have access to them, that way is never about improving or changing as a person, and it absolutely is not about understanding them or respecting their boundaries. Now, this is excess of explication is to make it very clear when I say Megatokyo is a misogynist story, I'm doing so after reading the whole thing, and I'm bringing lists of examples where women aren't just objectified and demeaned, but also treated as unreasonable and cruel for how they fail to flatter and support the egos and mindsets of men who have done nothing to improve in their lives. And this isn't even the point here. This is foundational to the point. See, another element of this analysis, our attack of the clones of this point, is the way that Largo and Pierrot treat one another, mostly focusing on how Largo treats Pierrot. It's not a complicated relationship. Largo belittles, degrades, and exploits Pierrot, ignores his opinions, and dismisses everything he's interested in where it fails to overlap directly with things that introduce Largo. Pierrot can play Largo's games, but Largo does not play Pierrot's games because Pierrot's games are not correct. This is because Pierrot is weak, is sissy, is a girl, and is emo. This structure of a man degrading another man for being a man inappropriately is a structure you might be familiar with as toxic masculinity. Finger in the page there though, because we know that Pierrot is not a man wrong. Pierrot shares in masculinity with Largo as shown by him asserting himself through the appropriate violence and being similarly oppressed by women in the universe of Megatokyo. Surprise! The author and trans misogyny! The bridge in Megatokyo between the misogyny of men patrolling the boundaries of gender, the and knuckles of this structure, is the question of realness of women and the disgust expressed by anything that doesn't strictly rest in the correct category of either. Women can be women wrong by being threatening, by playing games wrong, or by being sex workers. Men can be men wrong, only by being like women. And at this point, it's very easy to see how these are the same ideas being projected onto two different types of people. It's cissexism, as described by Julia Serrano in Whipping Girl, where there's a proper way to be your gender, and the system of patrolling and violence is wielded in order to ensure that only women are women right, and only men are men right. This creates a superstructure where a man being mistaken for a woman is a problem, but a man being a woman is taken as a deep, horrifying betrayal. It shows you the boundaries of gender and how they are to be patrolled. This transmisogyny isn't what I'd consider very intentional. I think the author doesn't actually know anything about trans women, and therefore the idea of an actual relationship with a gender is a void. Pierrot playing girls in video games is seen as something alien to the conversation about Pierrot's gender, and Pierrot being misidentified in a game as a woman startles and confuses him because that suggests that there's something impossible about a man who can be identified as a woman. This absence of understanding of trans people and their relationship to gender creates an obvious gap in the story that can be answered incredibly easily. Toya and Ping are both constantly confused by other people about whether or not they are real girls. Ping and other robots like her are a kind of sex worker you can own, but it is seen as intuitively wrong to treat them as women, despite them being literally entirely coherent and prone to behaving like women, with interests and emotional reactions and anxieties and preferences about how they want to be treated. If you have a coherent model of gender and identity, it's impossibly easy to resolve this. Ping is a woman because Ping wants to be a woman. At that point, the dehumanization that comes from the idea of a programmed identity just vaporizes. And we know that people can choose to be women. Pierrot plays at being a woman in a game with Toya, has had sex as a woman, and has become pregnant as a woman. This is treated as something shameful to avoid and escape, even though it's literally the most interesting thing about him, and touches on something I think that a lot of online MMO-engaged millennial boys have experience with. The idea of playing a woman and then disengaging from the thought for fear of what it might say. From this, I make the case that the author is most concerned about in Megatokyo is women, specifically the fear and hatred of women as an other, and therefore the deep and abiding fear of being a woman. The author and emulated oppression. It's a common thing amongst authors in privileged classes, like me, just to be clear, to be unaware of how their work replicates systems of oppression. We tell stories that include ideas of racism and misogyny and cissexism and all sorts of other axes of oppression that don't ever engage with the position we inhabit in that. Megatokyo examines structural oppression in its narrative, but not racism or cissexism, and instead targeting Pierrot and Largo as fanboys. This is a bit of a term of art here, mind you. The story doesn't settle on a specific term. It uses fans, fanboys, and otaku at different points. In Japan, where Megatokyo is meant to be set, visual novels, anime, and video games are common, mainstream, even unimportant forms of interest. Despite this, whenever these interested in these things are introduced, the audience of the text, characters in the world, express disgust or disdain for them. There is a common term for fanboys, a specifically gendered term, referring to men who express these interests. Women are not represented as having those interests, and typically even have a disdain for them, even women who are involved in these industries. Megatokyo's cast includes Nanasawa, who is a voice actor working for a company making a visual novel, Hayasaka, who is a former idol who works for a gamer supply store, and Toya, a character who is from a visual novel, in the real world. Ping is a visual novel peripheral, an entire sapient humanoid made to support this game type. Not one of these women express any interest in the genre of media they represent. Hayasaka cosplays, but it's never shown as anything but for work, and she even expresses a distaste for the job because of having to interact with the people interested in it. Nanasawa doesn't ever express any interest in playing the game she's involved with adapting. It doesn't even seem to be an idea she's considered, and that's one of those norms. Girls don't engage with games. They're a thing for boys. Despite these people all being directly involved in these industries, they are still positioned as outsiders to the interest. Things that oppose the fanboys who exist to supply money and buy things and be culturally disdained for their social incompetence. That is, there are the consumers and there is the consumed, and this class of consumers are people who are by default there to be disregarded, homogenized, and exploited. People think the worst of the fanboy class, and they are a common, normative object of disdain. They are compared directly to zombies, and there appears to be almost no engagement with fanboy interests that is not treated by the story as fundamentally poisoned. Now, this is not to say that Largo and Piero are meaningfully marginalized. The author does not seem to want to present them as suffering for their interests, which is why they have been so much social infrastructure without meaningful challenges. Largo is capable of having a job as a school teacher and gets paid day to day in cash. Piero gets a job without applying for it, and that job seems incredibly forgiving of his time management, with no or low rent lodging, and all within a few weeks of arriving in Tokyo. Neither is subject to racist policing or commercial exclusion, and Piero isn't even seen as being not Japanese. They can freely acquire computer hardware, weapons, armor, and clothes, and just ludicrous quantities of alcohol. Their ability to exist in Japan is itself on a visa category that seems biased towards enabling fanboy interests, playing Mortal Kombat 5. Nonetheless, both Piero and Largo express dismay at being seen as or treated badly, not by specific people, but as part of a category-wide oppression. Piero asserts that women interpret what he's doing for the worst, even when he's in the middle of coincidences that he should be able to address by communicating with the women in question. It's not just Piero and it's not just misogyny though. Largo thinks that women misunderstand him and fail to appreciate him for all the good, hard work he does. What's more, this kind of attitude about how he's treated is in direct contrast with the way that unnamed and irrelevant characters, like his students, routinely talk about how great everything Largo does is. A place to look for the hallmarks of marginalization is the law. In Megatokyo, the law doesn't get involved too often, since it's mostly their bounce against Largo, who lives almost consequence-free. In Chapter 11, when Piero is arrested, we see that his bail post is insultingly low, around $70, because the police believe it's impossible for him to have that much money. He is, after all, an otaku, a term they use in the translation of their Japanese, implying that this specific key noun, and probably therefore a category. When Nanasawa blows up on the radio program criticizing the hosts, it isn't a matter of standing up for men. She attacks the male host who has too much comfort and ease with women for being an oppressor too. From this, I make the case that the author presents fanboys as experiencing a specific axis of structural oppression while seemingly not recognizing other, more real forms of it. Now, after all that, you may think, hey, that's a lot. Surely we're past the worst of it. I have some bad news. The author and racism. It's pretty reasonable as a guess that the author is American. They position their point of view characters as American. The story starts in America. The default text of the story is written in American English. And the reference material the story uses seems to align pretty closely with the experience of an American person. The story is set in Tokyo, and I think before I go a step further, I have to reintroduce the work of Edward Said. Orientalism is a 1978 book that's so important that that's literally all of its title, and it's a book that did a lot to change the way that academia considered the way that the Orient, which is to say every part of the world that isn't the European American West, is examined and described. This idea of Orientalism is a really powerful one for considering the way a dominant culture describes and examines a culture that isn't their own, and the way that it uses the other as a reference to itself, and in the process, the other cultures get squished down into a caricature of what they are. The simplest version of Orientalism is, get a load of these white people. I bring up Orientalism because I need the term to refer to Megatokyo. It isn't what you might consider conventionally racist if you're looking to see racism as someone calling someone else a slur. The racism of Megatokyo is instead that of Orientalism, an uninformed person trying to describe an other culture through their own lens and with the assumption that their own experiences are universal and the people they are describing are mysterious and unknowable. It's dehumanizing even as it asserts the position of the outsider as expert. How then does Megatokyo represent its Japan? What informs its vision of Japan, and how is the story set in Tokyo about or like Tokyo? Or, what are the signs we can draw on to indicate that the author set their story in Japan while thinking that Japan is basically America? Across my reading experience, I took notes every time the comic displayed something about the world that was obviously not how the world works in Japan, but is representative of how things work in America. Some of them, I suppose, are to be accepted under the context of being humor, like it's totally understandable that Largo can get a job in Japan as an English teacher because that's meant to be a joke. It would be pretty cruel of me to just list the way that Megatokyo's Japan was instead representing America. I'm going to do that, though. Japan has a national public health insurance, which means that you don't get health insurance through your job, and paying to replace glasses is like $30. Businesses in Japan don't have American-style dumpsters where you throw functional computer parts. Japanese waste disposal is handled with common fenced-off areas. Japan has a lot of well-supported gun control laws, which is why you can't pull guns in the street and it's not immediately obvious to draw attention. This happens on so many pages it's ridiculous. Japanese police don't hold you until you pay bail. They hold you for the maximum time to investigate, which is 23 days. Police have a lot of control over these things. Japanese script is traditionally written top to bottom, right to left, not left to right, top to bottom. Junpei gets a note on a unicorn that is written American style, from his ninja masters. Japanese language expresses itself with a range of personal pronouns that express ideas like gender and relationship to the other. Junpei in Japanese calls himself Junpei and speaks in Japanese in the same broken English translation he does when he speaks English. That's weird, and it implies that Junpei's Japanese is broken English in brackets, and not its own language with its own clear modes of expression. The police in Japan don't keep heavy weapons and armor at home. Japanese people are typically very aware of non-Japanese people based on their phenotype and appearance, and can be quite racist about foreigners, even other Asian foreigners, such as the racism against Korean people. Piro and Toya, both despite being not Asian and adults, blend seamlessly into Japanese society, masquerading uncommented on in high school. Piro complains that eating convenience food store is bad, which is just really petty. Japanese vending machines don't use quarters. This is me trying to point to only the easiest things to check. There are other implications, like the idea that Lago would be able to bluff being an English teacher when he can't speak English, or that the teachers can just leave the school building freely with their class without comment, or the way that Piro could just start living someplace without paperwork or passport, and that therefore the boys can just bring their assertion, their identity of belonging here everywhere they go because they are the default humans, white American males. Now, one could describe these as mistakes, and they are. They're just incorrect things for representing Tokyo that anyone could address with a simple DuckDuckGo search. The problem with the errors is that they're common and widespread and persistent through the whole of the text, which suggests it's not a matter of some ideas slipping through the research, but rather no research being done at all. Which also implies there's no need for research, which is another Orientalist trope. The idea that the dominant culture doesn't need to do anything to understand the othered culture, because the othered culture is just a subordinate curiosity to the dominant culture. The author doesn't need to do this research because they already understand the space, and their understanding of the space is informed by what does show up in Tokyo. Things like Godzilla, video games, and horror stories of otaku culture. There is an extremely generous interpretation of the text in which these are cognates with the word Tokyo in Japan from our world, but instead represent an entirely fictional space in a suburb of Milwaukee. But unfortunately, I think that that's not the case here. From this I make the case that Megatokyo is a comic by an American author striving to represent a fantasy version of Tokyo as informed only by the fandom materials the author understands. The author and authorship. Well, we've tackled the misogyny and the racism, let's do something light to go round out the important ideas of Megatokyo. Megatokyo seems to consider itself in a position to discuss the idea of creating characters in media for people to consume and what it means when people express interest in and appreciation of characters. There's conflicting sources across the text, but one repeated theme is the place of characters in stories that have some form of negative feeling and what that means for the story and its audience. There's this joke from one of the guest comics early on that Piro as an artist needs to be calmed down from self-harm by imagining sad girls in snow, and this carries through into the sketchbook Yui critiques. The girls are sad, and that's what Piro connects to drawing. There's also the story of Nanasawa, who expresses sadness, which gets the directors to express the character she came in to voice differently. Hayasaka refers to being constrained by the narrative around her, and Toya then takes that idea and amplifies it, continuing the trend of doing things twice. From this I make the case that Megatokyo is a comic by an author who believes that there is a metatextual value to characters' suffering that is comparable to real suffering, and that is both necessary and tragic for the creation of the art they make. The author isn't good at this. Then there's a host of problems that feel a little unreasonable to point out, that just much less about the things the story's trying to do, and more that it's just about the execution of the storytelling. It isn't just that the ideas are bad, it's that they kind of incompetently expressed. It's entirely possible, for example, that everything I've described so far is only set up to pivot to a reveal that actually every major theme of the comic up to this point is wrong, but because it's taken so long to get to this point, it seems almost impossible for the narrative to deliver on that kind of twist. There's a problem persistent throughout the art of the run, which is same face. Most characters have very similar faces, and it can mean that there are story threads where if you turn from page to page, it can be unclear who is talking. Not because they're not on page, but because the person on page looks indistinguishable from even the person they're talking to. This is brought to a head with the example of Hayasaka being able to recognize a disguised Nanasawa because Hayasaka broke Nanasawa's nose once, and her nose, which you can't see, has been permanently marked by it. The architectural art, which is really nice most of the time in the pencil style, means that any situation where the background is wooden gives these overfilled backgrounds where the characters seem less important than the wood they're standing in front of. The pacing of the story as a webcomic seems to work directly at odds with things the comic is trying to do. There are a few times where the comic drops on a punchline that tells you something about the story, then immediately the next panel on the next page undoes the punchline. As an example, when Yuki examines Piero's sketchbook, the punchline panel is her being upset by what she finds, implying there's something inappropriate and sexy in the book. But then the next panel is her explaining to nobody that actually what she was looking at wasn't so bad. It feels like a direct attempt to undo something that the writer had already been committed to. It's cowardice. The pacing problem is also evident in just how long these things take versus how long they are in universe. The relationship between Nanasawa and Piro suffers obviously from this, where they sleep together, romantically, not sexually, on page 963, which is 7 years after the comic started. And that's a pretty good example of a slow burn story time frame. Except diegetically, these two characters met and exchanged their names 5 days ago. The Largo-Hayasaka relationship took place over the same time frame, and during that time, Largo fought Godzilla. I think under the same pacing problem, there's a trend towards the author repeating plot points, sometimes almost immediately. Yuki tries to return Piro's book bag twice. Piro forgets Yuki's drawing lesson twice. Piro has a first-time meet-cute with Nanasawa twice. Nanasawa quits and unquits twice. Hayasaka and Toya have plots that immediately follow one another about being secretly famous for having a horde to come to consume you. Most fascinatingly, a woman with a crush on Piro pretends to be Toya and fakes her death to distract the horde, leading to an enormous physical disaster. Twice! Under this model of the author we have so far, the author is divorced from all material needs or reasons that this can happen. An actual human who made this comic over the source of 2.5 decades, that human can have things like schedule slippage or wanting to make a mulligan or forgetting what they were doing and not realizing they want to make a character more important later. And all of those can explain the story choices which I'd normally just file as mistakes. Where the author is presenting the story they chose to tell, though, this is hard to explain and reconcile. Why would you just have Yuki and Nanasawa do the same thing twice? Why did Yuki bother doing her thing only to have Nanasawa do the same thing but modestly better? Why did Piro and Nanasawa have 2 meet-cutes? It's not like 2 is a super important number in the story. All of this, though, is further amplified by the fact that the author's writing is reliant on referencing the familiar to fill in information. That makes sense when the point of the story is about belonging to the fanboy category. As an example, the Largo-Hayasaka relationship has the structure of being a narrative that's pretty common in anime like Urusei Yatsura or Ranma 1/2, but without any of the thoughtful character writing that those series have. In Urusei Yatsura, there's a story of the alien girl Lum falling in love with Ataru, a lecherous idiot, but an important part of making that story work isn't that Ataru is a good person sometimes, but rather that Lum is really stupid. Similarly, Ranma 1/2 as a reference point seems to map, where you have this guy who does something stupid, then a woman responds with violent retaliation, but in Ranma 1/2, Ranma goes through development and gets to know Akane better, showing regular and routine attempts to improve and do things for her, and much of his sexual harassment of her is a mistake or coincidence. By contrast, Megatokyo's Largo-Hayasaka relationship refers to something, but can't support the depth of the material it's referencing. Which in some cases makes sense. How are you going to encapsulate the depth of a 600,000 word visual novel with a single page in a comic? The issue then feels like it's more about feeling authentic. Just like the way the story talks about Tokyo itself. There's an impression of attempting authenticity. Nothing in the narrative has the depth of the material it's referencing, which I have to assume reflects that the author lacks an awareness of ways to make these ideas more deep, or to draw on them in a way that's more meaningful than just surface. It's one of the things that feels like it should be a strength of Megatokyo. It's not about fandom, it's about being a fan. It wants to encourage and include as many people in their own fandoms as possible, but it's more interested in the perceived, aggrieved pressures against that fandom membership than it is in any way the actual fandoms themselves. And God help you if you're not a white guy. Conclusion. I started this examination by telling the story of the work of E.L. James. It wasn't just because I think Megatokyo is badly written. After all, I haven't read any of James's work, and it all sounds so dreadful I'd rather save myself the aggravation. Rather, it is because that 50 Shades of Grey exists because of a fruitful fandom that was willing to both gas up a creative and indulge deeply in a thing they wanted. It doesn't matter how absolutely embarrassing your terrible smut is if it can find the people interested enough in the premise of what if Edward Cullen was a different kind of abusive dickhead. Everything I've seen indicates that James is a frightfully tedious writer and person, just a real embarrassment of a human, and she had a community of people she could argue with and who would flatter her work, resulting in a chain reaction that culminated in a copy of 50 Shades of Grey being glued shut and chucked in the Bow River to make a point about NFTs. But that was not an opinion of someone on the forums. That was not an opinion of someone who once upon a time was a fan. I've never heard from anyone who makes media or writes essays or reviews books who was on that same forum where Snow Queen's Ice Dragon made the start on her billion-dollar hoard, and I don't imagine that anyone who's particularly invested in that time winds up in a position to make essays about how actually the fanfiction had some good points. I, however, was. I was there when these old words were laid down. I graduated high school in the year 2000, and I have memories of sitting in the last few science classes, where we were all just messing around because all the essays had been done and the teaching was past, and showing my friends these things I had downloaded and printed off, and really enjoyed. I showed them Lil Gamers, and I showed them Sluggy Freelance, and I showed them several pages of the best-looking comic among them, Megatokyo. This was maybe October, with a comic that had been publishing for months at most. I read Megatokyo aggressively during this period of my life. When I first brought my friend, who became my girlfriend, who became my partner, into my bedroom, I had a printed Megatokyo on my wall. I tried to draw art that was trying to look like Megatokyo with the soft pencils and the firm lines. What I'm saying is this is my circus, and I am one of the monkeys. I didn't spend thousands of words revisiting Megatokyo because I think this work is trash. I wanted to revisit it to do what I think is healthy for all writers, which is to reflect on things that inspired you and influenced you, and to examine what that means. Undeniably, there was an immense amount of work done on this project. 25 years of updates, and all without many of the things other comics of their type use to help address the problems only webcomics can have. Some webcomics trail off, some reset their continuity with a bomb of some variety, some double back and start over, and some even make comics trying to explain why their decisions 10 years ago were bad, actually. There's a certain kind of courage in moving forward, more or less, with what you were doing, more or less, 9 years ago, more or less. At the same time, the Megatokyo in aggregate is every bit the same kind of thing as 50 Shades of Grey. It's an unedited first draft of best impressions from a writer who is not up to the task they've put themselves, and whose production is spread so thin that they can't do any of the things that would make them better, or make their work easier. It is a work of effort and pain, and none of that makes the work better or venerates it in any way. Once upon a time, I said the kindest thing we could do for Megatokyo would be to institute universal basic income, so that it could be Fred Gallagher's personal project that he could tinker away at freely, and pick out the best editors to help him with the task, because the worst thing about Megatokyo were directly coupled to its presence as a commercial and commercially successful venture. Megatokyo is something with a heart that I want to nurture, with a desire and a hope for its potential that seemed preposterous for a product that has been successful, raised its money, fallen over, and sunk into the swamp. The want for what Megatokyo wants to be is something that I feel very strongly, but I think part of that want is about engaging with the thing as it actually is. Megatokyo is a thing that reflects everything of what it was and where it came from. A time of booth babes and under-examined racism, and a community that couldn't find a black person we hadn't successfully driven off. It is a work that said to me, relax, we understand you, and the you I was and the you it understood are people I have to forgive myself for being, even as I am so delighted to say I'm not anymore. Games are bigger than this. Anime is from Japan, which is a country which has its own culture and which we can learn about because we can talk to people who have been there. Women are people who have wants and inner lives that aren't about us, because us isn't just guys who want to position women as mysterious instead of us as unwilling to listen. And writing is hard, but it's hard because it's worth doing, and what makes it worth doing is sharing it with people who care about it, and by extension, care about you. Everything Megatokyo wants to care about is stuff that's worth caring about, and the fact that Megatokyo fumbles it relentlessly isn't because it's wrong to care about them. Megatokyo is a time capsule of August 2000, and it is a beautiful marker on the way to show how far we've traveled. It is still being produced by someone who still cares about it, and I'm glad it is. I want to make it better. I want to help it be better, and part of that is making sure you and I remember what it is. Here it is. The whole elephant. I hope you've enjoyed yourself.